It's hard to know to what extent the people of Europe sensed that they were still fighting a war, even if just one of ideologies, in 1950. Certainly, as the decade unfurled, the two sides of the Cold War were more clearly defined, and both sides did their best to demonize the other. But in the early 1950s, people within each regime were still just figuring out what it meant to be on either side of that Cold War. Within the Soviet bloc, the collection of states seen as loyal to the Soviet Union, Stalin continued his overwhelming authoritarianism in the name of the common, that is, Soviet, good. He crushed the Catholic clergy in Eastern Europe, which often protested the imposition of communism and the oppression of the workers. In addition, old agrarian elites, professionals, intellectuals, and members of the former middle class were discriminated against, imprisoned, or executed. Stalin's prison camp system in Siberia, the Gulag, did good business during these years. Even if political enemies weren't sent to Siberia, they were still often sent to hard labor camps. Prisoners sent to East German camps, for instance, did hard labor in dangerous uranium mines. Stalin accepted no criticism from his client nations. Adults were forced to attend education classes, women's groups, and public ceremonies, all meant to build loyalty to the regime. Anyone who did not fall in line faced being purged, regardless of how close they were to Stalin. One of those purged from Stalin's inner circle was Marshal Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov was a hugely popular war hero. He'd go down in history as the most decorated officer of both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. During World War II, Zhukov had met Dwight D. Eisenhower. The two shared a great respect and burgeoning friendship. In fact, Zhukov had invited Eisenhower on a railway tour of the USSR in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Here they are in a short video, no sound, which just demonstrates their congeniality. After the war, Zhukov was appointed commander of forces in Germany, but Stalin grew increasingly nervous both of Zhukov's friendship with major players in the West and with his popularity. Accordingly, Stalin replaced Zhukov as the commander of Soviet forces in 1946. When Zhukov contested the move, Stalin stripped him of his high status and sent him off to a series of distant commands in the East. Zhukov would eventually come back to favor in 1953 after Stalin's death, but his exile from Moscow was an indication of how serious Stalin was about loyalty and the adherence to his version of Soviet philosophy. Of course, it would have been increasingly hypocritical for Western Europe to criticize Soviet authoritarianism while maintaining non-independent European states themselves. Not that a little hypocrisy ever stopped anybody. In Europe, Britain still controlled the Irish Free State as a part of their empire. In the aftermath of World War II, as Britain was forced to focus on rebuilding and economic recovery, the British Parliament finally indicated that it would be ready to allow Ireland full independence. On the 1st of April of 1949, the Republic of Ireland Act declared Ireland a republic. The Constitution of Ireland remained in force, but with the functions previously given to the British King now given instead to the President of Ireland. In the same way, Britain had handed over administration of the British Mandate in Palestine to the UN in 1947. The UN took up the cause to create both a Jewish state and a Palestinian one, and drew up plans accordingly. In May of 1948, when the British Mandate officially ended, the head of the Zionist organization and the president of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, David Ben-Gurion, declared the foundation of the State of Israel. No borders were specified, not that it mattered. Israel was immediately plunged into a war with her Arab neighbors. In addition to Ireland and Israel, there was Greece. Although not technically a colony of any European power, Greece had been under the protection of the Concert of Europe since winning its independence in the early 19th century. After World War II, Western leaders hoped and expected that the Greek government, now liberated from the Nazis, would maintain either a constitutional monarchy with a parliament, like Britain's, or become a parliamentary democracy. To that end, Churchill had bargained with Stalin to maintain influence in Greece, and after war's end, Truman had been very interested in maintaining this status quo. However, in 1946, a communist uprising in Greece prompted the outbreak of civil war.
Before more hopeful signs appeared in the Greek situation, and when Elas partisans were operating at their fiercest, these pictures were secured in the streets of Athens. British troops give battle to Elas members who have refused to hand over their arms. Tanks had to be used, and at the EAM headquarters, one drives right into the doorway.
Over the next 3 years, Britain and the United States supported the Greek monarchy and her allies in their fight against the communists, which they did eventually defeat. But after the communist threat waned, so too did unity of purpose among non-communist political leaders. Long-standing tensions between Republicans in the Greek army and the royal family reemerged. Since the royal family was supported by the West, this necessarily meant that Greece and the Western powers also shared a tense relationship. As the 1950s loomed, however, it was finally time to focus on the home front. World War II had brought economics, whether free market or command, firmly under the government's umbrella, and during that time, government experts had planned everything from transportation to the coordination of production in different regions. These experts were called technocrats after 1945 and were required to base their decisions on expertise rather than on self-interest. After World War II, governments on both sides of the Cold War increasingly intervened in social conditions. Such policy of intervention came to be known as the welfare state, indicating that these states were no longer interested in just maintaining political order or augmenting their power. The welfare state encouraged population growth with direct financial aid. Often imitating the sweeping Swedish reforms of the 1930s, governments in the West expanded or created family allowances, health care and medical benefits, as well as programs for pregnant women and new mothers. In France, for instance, the government gave larger allowances for each birth after the first child. For many families, these allowances provided as much as 1/3 of the family's income. These reforms did have their downsides. In Britain, maternity benefits and child allowances favored women who did not work outside the home and provided little coverage of any kind for working women. In West Germany, strict legislation discouraged employers from hiring women. The people boasted that they had removed women from the workforce, claiming that such a move distinguished democratic practices from communist ones, because in the Soviet Union, both women and men were commanded to work outside the home. One result of the cutback in pensions and benefits to married women was their high rate of poverty in old age. In the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, women worked nearly full-time and usually outnumbered men in the workforce. Here, too, child care programs, family allowances, and maternity benefits were designed to encourage pregnancy. However, the scarcity of consumer goods often discouraged women from having large families, and since such women often had sole responsibility of domestic duties above and beyond their work outside the home, their workload increased with every child. State-funded medical insurance and subsidized medical care handled healthcare needs everywhere in Europe. Countries like Britain and the Soviet Union developed nationalized healthcare systems in which doctors and hospital employees worked for the state, and the country's entire population was covered by insurance. In other nations, citizens' medical expenses were reimbursed through social security plans. The immediate impact of better material conditions and the state provision of health care was found in an extended life expectancy and lowered rates of infant mortality. In addition, the number of medical doctors and dentists had more than doubled between 1919 and 1950, and vaccines greatly reduced death tolls from diseases such as tuberculosis, diphtheria, measles, and eventually polio. In England, the schoolchildren stood on an average an inch taller in the 1950s than their counterparts had a decade before. Better planning and education also diversified the diet of the population, which further bettered health conditions. Extended life expectancies meant that governments were also forced to establish programs for the elderly. Welfare state initiatives led to a higher standard of living. The network of state-built atomic power plants brought better electrification of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Governments also began to legislate better working conditions and more leisure time for workers. Beginning in 1955, Italian workers received 28 paid holidays annually. In Sweden, the number was 29 vacation days, and that number grew in the 1960s. The 1950s were a time of amazing economic growth. The West German economy grew at an annual rate of 8.2% during the first 4 years of the decade. France's economy grew 8% annually during the last 4 years. Britain's annual growth was a mere 3%, as they didn't face the same amount of reconstruction as other areas did. Interestingly, the brinksmanship of the Cold War helped to break the pattern of war and depression. So many nations had been focused on the creation of products which were aimed, or could be used for war, and this propelled the economy forward even when consumer markets rose and fell. Western European countries felt the need to establish economic alliances in addition to the defense pacts that had emerged in the 1940s. In 1951, Italy, France, Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands joined to form an organization which managed coal and steel production and prices. This European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC, also arranged for West German output to benefit Western Europe. The idea was that the bonds of common productivity and trade would keep the two traditionally hot tempers of Europe, France and Germany, from another war. In 1957, the Six then took a step towards regional prosperity when they signed the Treaty of Rome, which provided for the sharing of atomic resources through a commission called Eurocom and a trading partnership called the European Economic Community, the EEC, or the Common Market. The EEC reduced tariffs among the six partners and worked to develop common trade policies. It was, in part, aimed at preventing, quote, the race of nationalism, which is the true curse of the modern world. Britain pointedly refused to join the partnership, as membership required the surrender of certain imperial rights, making Britain just another European country. As a result, Britain continued its relative economic decline while other, traditionally stagnant economies, like that of Italy, suddenly boomed.
Ордена и медали, знаки великих заслуг товарища Сталина перед народами Советского Союза. Велико народное горе.
Stalin died in March of 1953, and as people mourned the man they considered their savior from Nazism and backwardness, troubles were appearing in the empire he'd ruled. Political prisoners who'd started rioting in the 1940s used his death to demand reform. In addition, other people were beginning to notice the sharp distinction in Soviet society. Even the leaders and bureaucrats who had not suffered the same deprivations as the rest of the Soviet Union began to worry that the system Stalin had created was in danger of falling in on itself and on them. Stalinism itself was challenged. A power struggle ensued, and protests took place across the empire. Amid turmoil, some of the prisoners of the Gulag were released, and prisoners at labor camps stopped working to emphasize their need for better food and the right to receive letters. In reaction to the sudden turmoil, the leadership of the Communist Party decided to increase the production of consumer goods, a policy referred to as goulash communism because it, in part, resulted in more food for ordinary people. It was incredibly apparent that the old Stalinist ways would simply not hold. In 1955, Nikita Khruschev, who'd been an illiterate coal miner before the revolution, outmaneuvered other rivals within the Communist Party to emerge as the leader of the Soviet Union, managing to do so without resorting to the usual executions. In 1956, he attacked Stalinism.
Gathering in the Kremlin, the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party springs a surprise on the world. Joseph Stalin, the man who ruled Russia for a quarter of a century, is publicly criticized for the first time. The critics include Premier Bulganin, his predecessor Malenkov, and Party Secretary Khrushchev. Khrushchev and his colleagues tell the delegates that for 20 years the party has suffered in all its work from one-man rule. Now, they announce, collective leadership has been restored and wider party democracy is promised.
Khrushchev denounced the cult of personality that Stalin had built about himself and announced that Stalinism did not, in fact, equal socialism. The secret speech that Khrushchev gave to the Congress, it was called such because it was not published in the Soviet Union, and yet it became widely known, worried communist parties around the world because it signaled a potentially large change in direction. As a result of this uncertainty, protest erupted in the summer of 1956 in Poland. Polish railway workers went on strike for better wages. Popular support for their cause forced the return of Wladislaw Gomulka, a communist victim of one of Stalin's earlier purges. Gomulka instituted a more liberal communist program in Poland. Hungarians then revolted against forced collectivization in October of 1956. Students and intellectuals used universities as political centers. The residents of Budapest filled the streets and demolished a statue of Stalin. The sheer number of protesters encouraged the Hungarian army to ignore their orders and join in the protest. As a result, a popular hero, Imre Nagy, was swept to power. When, however, Nagy announced the possibility that Hungary could leave the Warsaw Pact, Soviet troops moved into Hungary, killing tens of thousands and causing hundreds of thousands to flee to the west. Nagy himself was hanged. Despite Khrushchev's suppression of the Polish and Hungarian revolts, the early part of his time in office saw a thaw in East-West relations. Khrushchev made several trips to the West and was a more public figure than Stalin had been. Of course, that thaw could exist only so long as the Soviet leadership was convinced that it was winning the brinksmanship war, and, at the end of the 1950s, it clearly was.
On October the 4th, 1957, while the Americans were still finalizing their plans, Sputnik was launched.
Then its casing opened. The springs snapped, and the nose cone was pushed out of the way. A ball with 4 antennae emerged to go it alone in the darkness of space. And a radio began to send a signal back to Earth. Humanity had entered the space age.
In 1957, the Soviets launched the first artificial Earth satellite, Sputnik, and 4 years later put the first cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, in orbit around the Earth. This Soviet edge spurred the creation of the U.S. Aeronautics Space Administration, or NASA. Still, Khrushchev was too much of a product of Stalinism himself to completely do away with the Stalinist system, no matter how far ahead the Russians seemed to be. His government focused on spreading the message of Leninism in the emerging nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. He also continued to bully dissidents, although he didn't use the Gulag, as Stalin had. For instance, Khrushchev forced Boris Pasternak, the 1958 Nobel Prize winner in literature for Dr. Zhivago, to refuse the award because the book cast doubt on the glory of the revolution and affirmed the value of the individual. As the Soviet Union underwent challenges to its system, so too did the Western European powers, who struggled to maintain any sort of imperial presence, often in the face of expanding influence of communism. By 1950, communism had spread into China and the Korean peninsula, prompting a short conflict for control of South Korea. While the Western Allies were able to protect a republic in South Korea, France alone faced the struggle in Vietnam in the early 1950s. In the aftermath of World War II, Vietnamese freedom fighters who'd fought the Japanese for control of their country had simply shifted their focus to the French. Early in 1954, the French suffered a defeat at Dien Bien Phu against communist forces determined to make Vietnam both independent and communist. Back in France, the new socialist French premier, Pierre Mendès France, convinced the French government to extract itself from what appeared to be a civil war brewing in Vietnam. At the Geneva Convention of 1954, France agreed to let Vietnam go as a colony. Vietnam was then divided into 2 states. The UN did have a love affair with the 2-state solution. North Vietnam would become a communist regime led by Ho Chi Minh, while South Vietnam became a republic led by a succession of leaders often supported by the United States. Of course, Great Britain was also facing an imperial crisis. Britain's refusal to join Western Europe's economic alliances meant that she had to protect her own economic interests carefully. The first big test came in 1956 with the Suez Canal crisis. The canal had been a centerpiece of British interests. In fact, most of the reason that Britain had first occupied Egypt in 1882 was the strategic importance of the Suez Canal. In the 40s, about 2/3 of the oil from the Middle East, upon which Britain relied, was transported through the canal. In addition, the canal itself was owned primarily by the British government and British private stockholders, although the French government owned a part of it as well. By 1952, Egyptian nationalist sentiment against Britain was running high, partly because of the British government refusing to let Egypt occupy the Sudan, and so a group of young nationalist military officers overthrew the king in a bloodless coup.
From Cairo come these first authentic pictures of the bloodless coup by which the army took over control of Egypt. It was the end of the king's attempt to maintain power. Troops in the street were the first indication of the change to most people, until with a broad...
Gamal Abdel Nasser became the new head of the Egyptian government. He established Egyptian non-alignment during the Cold War, refusing to sign a treaty with the United States, because of its recognition of Israel mostly, and criticizing Turkey's and Iran's pro-American policies. Nasser's government demanded British withdrawal. In 1954, Britain and Egypt signed an agreement which was to begin a phased withdrawal of British troops, but which gave Britain the right to send military forces back if the canal was attacked, presumably by the Soviet Union. Egypt now became a pawn in the struggle between East and West, as both the US and Soviet Union tried to exert their influence over non-aligned nations. Egypt proved to be more open to the offers of economic aid from the Soviet Union, as the Soviet government agreed to exchange arms for Egyptian cotton. Then, after the United States pulled out of a World Bank loan which was to aid in the construction of the Aswan High Dam, largely because they were suspicious of British motives in helping to construct the dam, Egypt again turned to the Soviet Union. In July of 1956, Nasser made an important announcement.
From Alexandria, Egypt, Movietone News brings you the latest incident to upset the chancelleries of the free world. President Nasser delivering his fiery speech telling of his nationalization of the Suez Canal, a seizure from private interests that the Egyptian says is his answer to the West for refusing to finance the Aswan Dam. It's a situation fraught with implications. But undeterred, President Nasser raises his country's flag to symbolize his action. And although his followers hail him and carry him triumphantly on their shoulders, in London, Paris, and Washington, the fate of the strategic waterway causes grave concern.
As you can imagine, the British government was quite upset. They decided on armed intervention. France, too, wanted to remove Nasser from power because he was supporting the Algerian Liberation Front, the rebels seeking independence for French Algeria. In the meantime, the United States sought diplomatic negotiation. Israel was swept into the situation. The Israeli government was concerned with Egyptian ties to the Soviet Union, and the arrival of Soviet arms in Egypt raised suspicions that Egypt would possibly attempt an invasion of Israel. In October of 1956, the French convinced the British of the only possible strategy for military intervention in Egypt. A planned Israeli invasion of Egypt would force Egypt to call up an army around the Suez Canal, as it was near the Egyptian border. France and Britain would then issue an ultimatum calling for both armies to step away from the canal. When they refused to do so, a joint Anglo-French force would invade Egypt, occupy the canal zone, and force Nasser from power, all while allowing them to keep control of the canal. It all happened as planned, including the Anglo-French occupation of the canal zone, except that the canal proved unusable. Nasser had ordered the scuttling of ships in the canal to prevent movement on it. However, the world intervened. The UN General Assembly immediately called for a ceasefire and a day later, on November 4th, authorized a peacekeeping force to the canal zone. Both the US and USSR pressured Israel and Egypt to cease tensions. The US because it didn't want to be dragged into a war in such a touchy part of the world, and the Soviet Union because the situation in Egypt was keeping political leaders somewhat in the dark about the Soviet invasion of Hungary and the execution of Imre Nagy. The US made it clear that it would not support the continuation of Europe's colonial empires. Both Britain and France backed away from plans to unseat Nasser, and Egyptian decolonization proceeded rapidly. Britain's last problems with empire in the 1950s would come in Cyprus, its last territory in the eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus is not part of the Balkans, but its history has often followed parallel paths. The island was part of the Byzantine Empire, then fell under the control of the Franks, the Venetians, and finally the Ottoman Turks. In 1878, it was annexed by Great Britain. In the 1950s, the island had a Greek population of 430,000, who made up the largest concentrated body of Greeks living outside of Greece. The island also had a Turkish population of 95,000. In 1954, Greece proposed the union, Enosis, of the island with the Greek state, but the British refused to allow it. A guerrilla group called EOKA, the National Organization of Cypriot Fighters, then began a campaign of civil disobedience and political violence on the island in an effort to drive out the British. EOKA was led by Georgy Zhukov, a Cypriot-born former Greek army general identified with the anti-communist forces, who'd fought both during and after World War II. In 1955, a bomb exploded at the Turkish consulate in Salonika, in Cyprus. This sparked anti-Greek riots in Istanbul and Izmir, and Turkey called for Britain to partition the island to safeguard the rights of the Turkish minority there. Instead, Britain granted the island its independence in 1959. As it turns out, an independent Cyprus was acceptable to the majority of Cypriots, including to Archbishop Makarios III, an Orthodox cleric who was the leader of the Cypriot Greek community and who would become Cyprus's first president. Still, independence did not end all the tensions. In 1963, a crisis broke out over the proportion of Greeks and Turks in the Cypriot parliament, in the police, and in the bureaucracy, and this led to interethnic violence. A UN peacekeeping force was deployed to forestall a Turkish invasion to the island. Both Greece and Turkey resorted to military threats, but neither side was willing to engage in an actual war at that time. Throughout the 1960s, all of Britain's African and Asian territories would become independent. Many of them joined a group called the Commonwealth of Nations. Britain's Caribbean holdings, along with Australia, Belize, Canada, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea, became Commonwealth realms. These countries still recognize the monarch of Great Britain as their official head of state, even as they are otherwise entirely independent. While France had been forced to grant Vietnam independence in 1954, she wasn't so quick to grant independence to all of her colonies. In 1956, in the aftermath of the Suez Canal crisis, France did reluctantly let both Morocco and Tunisia go, but since neither country was hugely important to the French economy or military, this move didn't incite much domestic backlash. However, in 1954, Algeria had begun its own fight for independence under the Algerian National Liberation Front. While the arid interior of Algeria wasn't important to France, its Mediterranean coastal area had long been important to France for its agricultural capabilities. Thus, the prospect of Algerian independence was not so easy to take. While native Algerians were quick to fight for their independence, the French government had a harder time deciding how, precisely, they would address the situation. In May of 1958, a demonstration by French settlers in Algiers, they were angry at what they perceived to be inaction by the Fourth French Republic, turned into a military-led insurrection against the French government, who were in favor of a return of Charles de Gaulle to a leadership position in France. During this time, the Rally of the French People, the party that Charles de Gaulle had helped form, was gaining strength. The situation in Algeria was the perfect opportunity for de Gaulle to return to public office. At the end of May, the French president appointed him the Premier of France, which was approved by the National Assembly. De Gaulle accepted the new post on the condition that he would rule by emergency decree for 6 months, and then asked the nation to approve a new constitution. The military, especially in Algeria, was thrilled with de Gaulle's return to power. They felt that he would never allow Algerian independence. De Gaulle's new constitution increased presidential authority and the presidential term to 7 years. In September of 1958, 80% of French voters approved the constitution which created the Fifth French Republic. De Gaulle did deal with the Algerian situation. He'd estimated the costs of the continuing war and determined that they were too high. He removed the generals responsible for the coup in May and generally seemed open to allowing Algerian independence. To some officers, de Gaulle's actions were a betrayal of the military. These and other right-wing parties now rioted against de Gaulle in early 1960. In addition, the secret army group tried several times to assassinate de Gaulle and engaged in terrorist activities toward the civilian population of Paris, which, by and large, supported Algerian independence. Given the opportunity to vote for their future, the Algerians opted for independence. In France, the vote for Algerian independence held in July 1961 was 15 million for, 5 million against. In March 1962, the Algerian War officially ended, with the French overwhelmingly ratifying the peace terms. In July, Algeria officially became independent.
The climax of 8 years of turbulent struggle for independence in Algeria as native troops march openly in Oran to take part in victory celebrations. The wild cheers and the dancing in the streets, however, is overshadowed by a split in the ranks of the new government. Even as Algerians celebrated, a rift develops between the new premier and his vice premier over the terms of the provisional government's agreement with France.
Charles de Gaulle was now a leading figure in French politics. As an individual, he's quite unique. He believed that France had a special historic mission. He feared the domination of France by Britain and the US, and his domestic policy often reacted to that fear. De Gaulle insisted that France maintain an independent nuclear capacity so as not to be dependent on foreign coal for its electricity. To this day, France continues to be a leader in alternate fuels. In some places of France, nuclear energy comprises 80% of its electrical capabilities. In order to facilitate this defensive stance against Americanization, de Gaulle also fostered a close diplomatic relationship with Germany. This relationship would form the cornerstone of that much bandied entity, the New Europe of the 20th century. Although much of his political support came from the right, de Gaulle insisted on his objectivity. He would say, quote, "De Gaulle is not left, or on the right, or in the middle. De Gaulle is above." And yes, he often spoke of himself in the third person, sometimes even using the royal we. Just as Algeria was settling into independence, the world abruptly shifted its focus to a little island off the coast of the United States, which had suddenly become a hotbed. In 1959, Cuba had experienced a communist revolution which brought Fidel Castro to power. He'd had the full support of Khrushchev's government, and so, in the early 1960s, Castro repaid Soviet support by allowing the government to begin building military outposts, including strategic missile defenses, on Cuba. When the U.S. became aware of the situation in October of 1962, the tense diplomacy which eventually ended the Cuban Missile Crisis reiterated Cold War ideology. While both the U.S. and Soviet Union claimed to have won in the aftermath of the crisis, it was clear that Khrushchev had been the one to back down. The United States, and thus the West, emerged stronger as a result. The thawing of the Cold War was over. Economic stagnation and the humiliation of the Cuban Missile Crisis contributed to Khrushchev's sudden fall from power in 1964. In October of that year, Khrushchev returned to Moscow for a meeting called by his enemies within the party. He found that he was being forced into retirement. The Soviet leadership wanted someone else in charge. The person chosen to lead the Soviet Union was Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev had risen through the ranks of the Communist Party through Khrushchev's assistance and had become the general secretary of the party. He was much less impulsive than Khrushchev, and he returned government policy to communist orthodoxy. Where Khrushchev had been known as the public figure, the man who went out and shook hands, Brezhnev was known for his rather bushy eyebrows. Brezhnev affirmed the authority and prestige of the Soviet bureaucracy and of the KGB, the Soviet secret police. Still, he stopped short of a complete return to Stalinism. He ordered the building up of Soviet military capability, but also increased the production of consumer goods. All the while, centralized planning and collectivized agriculture remained the basis of the Soviet economy, which actually further weakened the system. By this point in the 1960s, some communists began questioning the validity of the Soviet system. When, they wondered, would the socialist prosperity promised in 1917 arrive?